To anyone who hasn't scraped a living from the bottom of an oil pan, a mechanic's permanently stained cuticles and calloused palms just smell like failure. At 32, Jude was starting to agree. He was drowning in final notices, desperate to provide for a 6-year-old boy who deserved far better than a father chronically reeking of exhaust. Treat a man like the dirt on a tire long enough, and the label sticks, at least, until a midnight blowout and a sobbing teenager completely altered the equation. Sweat stung Jude's eyes, mixing with a thin layer of brake dust and regret. It was Friday afternoon in July, the kind of heat that made the asphalt outside his 2-bay garage ripple like water. He stood by the open hood of a 2019 Audi, running a dirty rag over his hands, trying to get the worst of the grime off before the owner came back. His son, Toby, was sitting on a milk crate in the corner of the shop, pushing a die-cast fire truck over a crack in the concrete. He was humming to himself, oblivious to the fact that the bank had called twice that morning. "Is this some kind of joke?" The voice cut through the hum of the oscillating fan. Jude turned. Gregory stood in the doorway of the office. He wore a crisp, powder blue linen shirt that probably cost more than Jude's compressor. He was holding up a white microfiber cloth, pointing to a faint black smudge on the leather steering wheel of his Audi. "I brought it in for a simple brake flush, Jude," Gregory sneered, stepping into the bay. He looked around the shop with naked disgust, his eyes lingering on a stack of bald tires before snapping back to the mechanic. "I didn't ask you to roll around in the interior like a feral dog. Do you have any idea how much this leather costs to replace?" Jude swallowed the metallic taste of anger in the back of his throat. He wanted to tell him to get his car out of the shop. He wanted to throw the wrench in his hand through his windshield. Instead, he looked at Toby, who had stopped humming and was watching them with wide, uncertain eyes. "I apologize, Mr. Hayes," Jude said, forcing his voice to stay level. It felt like chewing glass. "I'll clean it up right now using the proper solvent. Won't take a minute." "Don't bother." Gregory tossed the cloth onto the hood of his car. "I'll have it detailed across town. A real shop. Just give me the keys." Jude reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric, and pulled out the fob. He wiped it meticulously on his jeans before handing it over. "That'll be $85 for the fluid and labor." Gregory barked a laugh. He pulled a $50 bill from a silver money clip and let it flutter to the floor between them. It landed in a small puddle of power steering fluid. "Consider the rest a penalty for the detailing," he said, turning on his heel. "Be lucky I don't sue you for property damage. You people shouldn't be allowed to touch machinery you can't even afford to sit in." He got in, fired up the engine, and peeled out of the lot, kicking up a spray of gravel that rattled against the aluminum siding of the shop. Jude stood there for a long time, staring down at the bill soaking up the pinkish fluid. The smell of burning rubber hung heavy in the stifling air. His jaw ached from clenching it. "Dad?" Toby was standing a few feet away, holding his fire truck. His face was smudged with dirt. "Why did that man drop his money?" Jude closed his eyes, took a breath that smelled like rust and stale coffee, and forced the corners of his mouth up. He walked over, knelt down so his knees popped on the hard concrete, and picked up the soggy bill. "He was just in a hurry, buddy," Jude said, wiping the fluid off the face of Ulysses S. Grant. "Come on, wash your hands. We're getting pizza tonight." It was a lie. They were getting store-brand macaroni, but as Jude scrubbed his hands with gritty orange pumice soap at the slop sink, watching the dark water swirl down the drain, he felt the familiar, heavy weight of failure settle into his ribs. He wasn't a man anymore. He was just a pair of hands to be rented, mocked, and discarded. Rain lashed against the windshield of Jude's F-150 in heavy, violent sheets. It was nearing midnight. The truck's wipers were dry-rotted, shrieking against the glass with every pass, doing little to clear the blinding downpour. Toby was asleep in his booster seat in the back, his head lolling to the side, breathing through his mouth. They were driving back from Jude's sister's house 2 towns over. She had lent him $200 to keep the shop's electricity on, a humiliation he was still trying to digest. The highway was a black ribbon of nothing. Nobody was out in this weather. Then the taillights caught his eye. A sleek silver silhouette sat tilted dangerously on the muddy shoulder of the bypass. Hazard lights pulsed rhythmically, casting an eerie orange glow through the rain. As he got closer, the headlights illuminated the badge, a brand new Mercedes-Benz AMG, $150,000 of German engineering sitting in the mud. Jude eased off the gas. "Keep driving," a voice in his head muttered. "Not your problem, Jude. You're off the clock. You're exhausted. Your boots are leaking." But as he passed, he saw her. A girl, no older than 17, pacing frantically in the mud by the front right wheel. She was wearing a thin sequined dress, completely soaked, her hair plastered to her face. She was holding a cell phone to her ear, sobbing so hard her shoulders heaved visibly even through the sheets of rain. Jude hit the brakes. The truck fishtailed slightly before settling on the shoulder 100 feet ahead of the Mercedes. He sat there for a second, listening to the drum of the rain on the metal roof. He looked at Toby in the rearview mirror. He hadn't stirred. Cursing under his breath, Jude grabbed his heavy maglite and his worn canvas tool bag from the passenger floorboard. He popped the door and stepped out into the deluge. The cold water hit him like a slap. He jogged back toward the Mercedes. As he approached, the girl saw him and instantly backed away, her eyes wide with terror. She dropped her phone into the grass. "Stay back!" she screamed, her voice cracking over the sound of the storm. "My mom is on her way. She's calling the police." Jude stopped immediately, holding his hands up, palms out. The flashlight beam cut through the rain, illuminating her ruined high heels and the flat, completely shredded low-profile tire behind her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he shouted over the wind, keeping his voice as calm and flat as possible. "I'm a mechanic. I saw you crying. You hit that pothole a quarter-mile back, didn't you?" She shivered violently, wrapping her arms around her thin frame. I didn't see it. The car just pulled, and then it sounded like an explosion. Oh God, my mom is going to kill me. She told me not to take this car." "Take a breath, kid." Jude stepped a little closer, keeping his movement slow. "Do you have a spare in the trunk?" "I don't know," she wailed, panic taking over again. "I don't know anything about cars. Please, I just want to go home." "Pop the trunk," he said. "Get back inside the car where it's dry. Lock the doors if it makes you feel better. Just pop the trunk first." She hesitated, staring at his grease-stained jacket, his scruffy beard. He knew how he looked, like a guy who had nothing to lose. But she nodded, darting to the driver's door, opening it, and hitting a button. The trunk glided open silently. She slammed her door shut, and Jude heard the heavy thunk of the locks engaging. He walked to the back of the car. He pushed aside expensive leather duffel bags and found the compartment beneath the floorboard. Thank God, a space-saver spare. But as he hauled it out, his stomach sank. Locking lug nuts. He walked up to her window and tapped the glass. She jumped, rolling it down an inch. "I need the key for the lug nuts," he said. "Check the glove box, little metal socket." She fumbled around in the dark for a minute before passing it through the crack. For the next 20 minutes, Jude fought a war against the elements and German torque specs. The mud sucked at his knees, soaking straight through his jeans to the skin. His knuckles bled where the lug wrench slipped and smashed against the brake caliper, but the icy rain numbed the pain instantly. Every time he breathed, he inhaled the smell of hot, shredded rubber and wet dirt. He grunted, throwing his entire body weight onto the iron bar to break the factory-tightened nuts free. His back screamed, his vision blurred from the rain. Finally, the flat tire came off with a suctioning squelch. He hoisted the spare on, hand-threaded the bolts, and cranked them down. When he lowered the jack, he tossed the shredded tire into her trunk and slammed it shut. He walked back to her window and tapped again. She rolled it down halfway this time. The heater was blasting inside. It smelled of vanilla perfume and expensive leather. "You're good to go," Jude said, wiping mud off his face with a greasy sleeve. "Keep it under 50 miles an hour. Get to a dealership tomorrow." She stared at him, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark rivers. She reached into the center console and pulled out a damp $50 bill. "Here," she said, her voice shaking. Thank you. Thank you so much. Jude looked at the 50. His mind immediately flashed back to Gregory's money, soaked in steering fluid on his shop floor. His pride bristled, hot and ugly in his chest. Keep it, he said roughly. Buy a better umbrella. He turned his back on her and walked through the mud to his truck. He didn't look back until he was in the driver's seat, blasting the heater on his numb hands. He watched her pull back onto the highway, the taillights disappearing into the storm. He sat there, shivering, bleeding, and utterly exhausted. Toby mumbled in his sleep. Jude put the truck in drive and limped home. Saturday mornings at the shop were usually quiet. Jude was sitting at the scarred metal desk in the office, sipping a mug of black coffee that tasted like burnt copper. His knuckles were wrapped in white athletic tape, throbbing in time with his pulse. His back felt like it had been hit by a freight train. Toby was watching cartoons on an old iPad by the window. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled Jude's attention to the bay doors. A black SUV pulled into the lot. It wasn't just any SUV, it was a Rolls-Royce Cullinan. It looked like a matte black tank, utterly out of place against the backdrop of rusted chain-link fences and faded pawnshop signs across the street. The engine shut off. A driver in a dark suit stepped out, opened an umbrella, even though it was only drizzling, and opened the rear passenger door. A woman stepped out. She wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit that hung with lethal perfection. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe knot. She had high cheekbones, pale skin, and eyes that looked like shattered flint. She didn't look at the cracked pavement beneath her Louboutins. She looked straight into his open garage bay, right at him. Jude's stomach gave a hard, sour twist. He stood up, grabbing a rag to wipe his hands, though they were already clean. She walked into the bay, the driver lingering a few paces behind her like a shadow. She stopped a few feet from Jude, her eyes sweeping over the disorganized tools, the oil stains on the floor, and finally settling on his taped knuckles. "Are you Jude?" Her voice was crisp, lacking any inflection or warmth. "I am. What can I do for you?" She didn't offer her hand. Instead, she crossed her arms. He could smell her perfume, something sharp, expensive, and intimidating, sandalwood and citrus. "My name is Victoria Carmichael. My daughter is Chloe." She paused, letting the name hang in the air, watching his face for a reaction. "She came home last night at 1 a.m, terrified, missing a front tire on a vehicle she was expressly forbidden to drive." "Right," Jude said slowly. "The Mercedes on Route 9. I changed her flat." "You did," Victoria said, her tone sharpening into a blade. "She told me a man in a pickup truck stopped in the middle of a torrential downpour, in total darkness, to help her." "That's right." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. "Excuse me?" Victoria took a half step closer. "I asked why, Jude. Men do not stop on deserted highways in the middle of the night out of the goodness of their hearts. Not anymore. I want to know exactly what happened out there. I want to know what you said to my daughter." Jude's jaw tightened. The exhaustion in his bones flared into sudden defensive anger. She wasn't here to thank him. She thought he was a predator. She thought he had an angle. "Lady," he said, his voice dropping an octave, raw and tired. "I was driving home. I saw a kid crying in the rain. I stopped, I changed her tire, and I left." That's the entire story. "She said you refused the money she offered," Victoria countered, her eyes narrowing. "People like you don't refuse money unless they want something else. What did you ask her for? Her number? Did you take pictures of the license plate? Are you planning a lawsuit because you bruised your hands touching my property?" Jude threw the dirty rag onto the workbench with a loud smack. The driver behind her tensed, slipping a hand inside his jacket. "People like me?" He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You mean broke people? Mechanics? People who don't drive $500,000 cars?" He stepped forward, closing the distance. He was taller than her, but she didn't flinch. "Let me tell you something, Mrs. Carmichael," he said, pointing a taped finger at the concrete floor. I spent 30 minutes in the freezing mud last night wrestling with over-torqued lug nuts because your kid was having a panic attack. I didn't want to stop. I wanted to go home and sleep. But I have a kid of my own, and if he were ever stuck on the side of the road, I'd hope to God someone wouldn't just drive past because they were worried about how it looked." Victoria stared at him. Her flinty eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second breaking her icy facade. Before she could speak, a small voice echoed from the office. "Dad, did you break another wrench?" Toby shuffled out of the office, holding his iPad, rubbing one eye with a small, grubby fist. He stopped when he saw the strangers in the bay, immediately retreating and wrapping his arms around Jude's leg, hiding his face against the mechanic's jeans. Jude put a heavy, calloused hand on his head, stroking his hair. The anger drained out of him instantly, replaced by a deep, weary embarrassment. He hated that Toby had to see this. He hated that he lived in a world where a father had to constantly defend his own existence to people who held all the cards. Victoria Carmichael looked down at the boy clinging to his leg. The silence in the garage stretched out, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. She uncrossed her arms. The rigid posture seemed to melt just a fraction, revealing a brief, terrifying glimpse of a mother who had spent the entire night imagining the worst possible scenarios. "That's your son?" she asked quietly. The venom was completely gone from her voice. "Yeah," Jude mumbled, looking away. "That's Toby." Victoria let out a long, slow breath. She looked at his taped, bruised hands again, and this time Jude saw the realization hit her. There was no scam. There was no ulterior motive, just a tired father who had ruined his hands to get her daughter home safe. She reached into her blazer pocket. Jude braced himself for the checkbook. If she pulled out a check right now to assuage her guilt, he was going to rip it in half. Instead, she pulled out a sleek black business card and set it gently on the edge of the workbench. "I run a logistics firm," Victoria said, her voice softer, yet still carrying the weight of someone who commanded rooms. "We operate a fleet of 200 commercial delivery trucks in this state alone. I fired my lead maintenance contractor yesterday for overbilling me by 40%. Jude frowned, looking from the card to her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she replied, her eyes meeting his with a strange new respect, "that it is remarkably difficult to find someone in this city who actually knows the value of hard work, and even harder to find someone who does the right thing when no one is watching." She turned to leave, her heels clicking decisively on the concrete. She paused by the door, looking back over her shoulder. "Fix your coffee machine, Jude," Victoria Carmichael said, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touching the corners of her mouth. "I'll be back on Monday with 3 of my trucks, and I don't negotiate my labor rates." The Rolls-Royce disappeared down the road before he could even process what had just happened. He stood in the quiet garage, the smell of sandalwood lingering over the scent of motor oil, realizing that for the first time in years, he wasn't sinking anymore. Monday morning rolled in with the heavy, suffocating scent of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt. Jude was at the shop by 5, pacing the cracked concrete floor, nursing a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee. His stomach was a knot of battery acid and adrenaline. Part of him was convinced Victoria Carmichael was a ghost, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and unpaid bills. Rich people didn't hand out contracts to guys operating out of rusty two-bay garages. They handed out lawsuits and cease and desists. Then the ground shook. 3 massive matte black Isuzu box trucks turned onto his gravel lot, moving in a tight, synchronized convoy. They looked like bruised leviathans, battered by city miles and scraped against loading docks. The air brakes hissed violently, a sound like a cornered snake, as they parked in a staggered line blocking his entire frontage. A tall man in a tailored gray suit stepped out of the lead truck. He had the thick neck of a former linebacker and eyes that cataloged every exit in the perimeter. He walked into the bay, tossing a heavy ring of keys onto the workbench. "Mr. Carmichael sent these," he said. His voice sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. "First 3. Preventive maintenance, oil, filters, and she said to check the rear suspension on number 2. It's sagging. "Who are you?" Jude asked, eyeing the sheer mass of the man. "Cole, head of security." He didn't offer his hand. He just looked at the hydraulic lift, which maxed out at 10,000 pounds, and then at the 14,000-pound trucks outside. "You have the equipment for this?" "I have a pair of 20-ton bottle jacks and a concrete floor that hasn't cracked yet," Jude fired back, refusing to let him see the sheer panic bubbling in his throat. "I'll get it done." Cole gave a microscopic nod. "She expects an itemized invoice by Friday. Don't overcharge for the filters. I checked the receipts." He turned and walked out, getting into a trailing black sedan that had pulled up silently by the street. Jude stood alone with 3 commercial trucks and a silence that felt heavier than the iron sitting in his lot. When Toby woke up an hour later, Jude already had the first truck jacked up, resting securely on thick steel cribbing. Toby sat on his usual milk crate, wearing a pair of oversized, bright yellow ear defenders Jude had bought him at the hardware store. He was eating dry cereal out of a plastic bowl, watching his dad work. Commercial mechanics is not car repair. It is a war against gravity and sheer mass. Everything is heavier, thicker, and covered in a thick paste of road grime and gear oil that smells like sulfur and old, rotting garlic. By noon, Jude's back was screaming. Removing a single brake drum from a commercial axle required him to sit on the floor, wrestle 80 pounds of cast iron against his chest, and slide it off the hub without crushing his fingers. His knuckles, still bruised from the Mercedes, split open again. Blood mixed with the black grease on his hands, turning into a rusty, sticky paste. The pneumatic impact wrench roared, shaking his forearms until his teeth rattled. "This is it," he told himself, grinding his teeth as a rusted caliper bolt refused to budge. "This is the lifeline. If you screw this up, Jude, you're packing boxes at the Amazon warehouse by next month." He grabbed a 3-foot steel breaker bar, slipped a hollow cheater pipe over the end for extra leverage, and threw his entire body weight onto it. The bolt snapped free with a sound like a gunshot. He slammed his elbow into the concrete, biting back a string of curses so Toby wouldn't hear. The first truck took 12 hours. By Tuesday night, he was living on ibuprofen and stale vending machine crackers. The physical toll was brutal. Every muscle fiber in his shoulders felt like it was tearing, and the smell of diesel had permeated his skin so deeply he tasted it when he swallowed. But as he drained 60 quarts of pitch-black, sludgy oil into his catchment drum, a strange, feral satisfaction settled in his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't begging for scraps. He was earning his way out of the dirt. Wednesday afternoon brought a break in the humidity, replaced by a dry, stifling heat that baked the corrugated tin roof of the garage. Jude was under truck number 3, trying to trace a phantom leak in the pneumatic airline, grease caked into his hairline. "You're using the wrong grade of Teflon tape for commercial air fittings." The voice cut through the rhythmic thrum of the air compressor. He slid out from under the chassis on his creeper, blinking against the harsh shop lights. Victoria Carmichael was standing in the center of the bay. Today, she wore a tailored navy pencil skirt and a white silk blouse, holding a leather portfolio. She looked immaculate, an alien presence among the scattered tools and pools of degreaser. Jude wiped his hands on a rag, standing up slowly. His knees popped. "Hello, Mrs. Carmichael. And for the record, it's not Teflon tape. It's a specialized thread sealant. Teflon shreds and clogs the air valves." She looked at the yellow tube on the floor, then back at him. A very faint, genuine smile ghosted across her lips. "Fair enough. You know your trade." "What brings you down here?" he asked, stepping over an air hose. Cole already dropped off the purchase orders. "I like to see my investments in person," Victoria said, walking toward his small, cluttered office. She paused at the doorway, looking at Toby. He was asleep on a battered green sofa in the corner, a thin blanket draped over his legs, a toy truck clutched in one hand. Her expression softened, the hard lines of her face relaxing into something vulnerable. She watched him for a long moment before turning back to Jude. "Do you have anything to drink?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper so as not to wake the boy. I've been in board meetings with venture capitalists for 6 hours. If I hear the word synergy one more time, I'm going to set something on fire. Jude blinked. The billionaire CEO was asking for a beverage in a shop that didn't have running hot water. I bought a new coffee machine, he said, gesturing to the cheap plastic Mr. Coffee sitting on a filing cabinet. But the coffee is still Folgers, or I have bottled water in the mini fridge. Might taste a little like brake cleaner. Coffee is fine. Black. He poured the sludge into a styrofoam cup and handed it to her. She took a sip, winced slightly, but didn't complain. She leaned against the doorframe of the office, crossing her ankles. "They're circling me, Jude," she said suddenly, staring into the dark liquid in her cup. "My board of directors, my competitors. Ever since my husband passed away 3 years ago, they've been waiting for me to fail. They think because I have a daughter who acts out, and because I don't play golf with them on Sundays, that I'm weak." Jude leaned against the workbench, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't know why she was telling him this, but he knew what it felt like to be cornered. "Is that why you fired your old maintenance contractor?" he asked. Victoria's eyes hardened. "Donovan? Yes. He was overcharging me and splitting the difference with one of my own fleet managers. They thought I wouldn't check the line items. They thought I was just a wealthy widow who only looked at the bottom line." She looked at him, her gaze piercing. "I built the logistics side of this company from a single delivery van, Jude. I drove it myself. I know exactly how much a commercial brake pad costs. I know what a scam looks like. And what do I look like to you?" he asked, his voice flat. "You look like a man who is too tired to lie," she replied evenly. "You look like someone who has everything to lose, and therefore will do the job exactly as he promises. People with nothing to fall back on are the most reliable assets in the world." It was a cold, clinical assessment, but it was honest. He preferred it to pity. "You're a shark, Mrs. Carmichael," he said, taking a sip of his own bitter coffee. "Call me Victoria," she said, tossing the half-empty styrofoam cup into a trash can. "And yes, Jude, I am. You have to be, if you want to keep what's yours." She glanced at Toby again. "I suspect you know a little something about that." She set a thick manila envelope on the desk. "The contract. It guarantees you 20 trucks a month, at market rate, no negotiations. Sign it, get it notarized, and give it to Cole on Friday." Before he could say a word, before he could even process the fact that she had just handed him a secure financial future, she turned and walked out of the shop. Jude stared at the envelope, his hand shaking just enough to make the dirt on his knuckles blur. Friday evening. The heat had finally broken, leaving behind a cool, damp breeze that swept through the open bay doors. The 3 Isuzu trucks were parked neatly in a row outside, engines purring perfectly, brakes fully serviced, fluids flushed. Jude was wiping down his tools, his body aching with a bone-deep exhaustion that felt utterly victorious. Toby was in the office, playing a video game on the iPad, the volume low. He was about to close the bay doors when a heavily modified Ford F250 pulled into the lot, tires crunching aggressively over the gravel. It parked sideways, blocking the exit. 2 men got out. They didn't look like customers. They wore thick canvas work jackets and heavy boots. The driver was thick-set, with a shaved head and a tribal tattoo creeping up his neck. The passenger was taller, wiry, carrying a heavy steel pry bar casually at his side. The air in the garage suddenly felt very thin. "You Jude?" the thick-set man asked, walking into the bay without waiting for an invitation. Jude set his wrench down on the bench. Slowly. "Shop's closed. Come back tomorrow." "We ain't here for an oil change," the wiry guy said, tapping the pry bar against the side of the hydraulic lift. The sharp clang echoed off the concrete walls. Donovan says hello?" the thick-set guy sneered, closing the distance between them. "He also says you're dipping your hands in his pockets. Carmichael's fleet belongs to our shop, not this garbage dump." Jude's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. But right behind it came a violent, desperate rage. These men were standing in his shop. Toby was 30 feet away. They were threatening the first real piece of security he had touched in years. "I don't know any Donovan," he lied, his voice remarkably steady. "I took a contract. Now get out of my shop." The thick-set guy laughed. He stepped up to the main tool chest, a battered red Snap-on Jude had bought used a decade ago, and kicked it hard with his steel-toed boot. The lock sheared. The drawers flew open, and thousands of dollars worth of sockets, wrenches, and ratchets cascaded onto the concrete floor with a deafening, chaotic crash. "Dad?" Toby's voice drifted from the office, laced with panic. "Stay in the office, Toby! Lock the door!" Jude roared, the facade of calm instantly shattering. The wiry guy lunged forward, swinging the pry bar toward the windshield of the nearest Isuzu truck. Jude didn't think. He reacted with the sheer, raw panic of a cornered animal. He grabbed a 2-foot steel breaker bar off the bench and swung it like a baseball bat. He caught the wiry guy directly in the ribs. He went down hard, the pry bar clattering away, screaming as the breath left his lungs. The thick-set man charged him. He tackled him around the waist, driving Jude backward into the metal workbench. His spine erupted in pain. He threw a heavy looping punch that caught Jude high on the cheekbone. His vision flashed white. He tasted blood, hot and metallic, flooding his mouth. He scrambled to stay on his feet, bringing the breaker bar up to defend himself, but the man grabbed his wrist, twisting it violently. They fell to the greasy concrete floor, grappling in a tangle of limbs, grease, and spilled tools. The intruder was heavier, stronger, pinning Jude down, raising his fist to cave his face in. Then a heavy muffled thwack echoed in the bay. The thick-set man's eyes rolled back into his head, and he collapsed on top of Jude like a sack of wet cement. Jude shoved his dead weight off, gasping for air, clutching his bruised ribs. Cole stood over them. The head of security was holding a heavy, leather-wrapped sap. He didn't look out of breath. He didn't even look angry. He just looked annoyed, like he had stepped in gum. "Mr. Carmichael sent me early to pick up the keys," Cole said flatly, looking down at the 2 groaning men on the floor. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a cell phone, and dialed a number. "Yeah, it's Cole," he said into the phone. "Tell Victoria she was right. Donovan sent muscle to the shop. Yes, Jude is fine. Handled himself mostly. Send a cleanup crew to the lot. And call our lawyers. Tell them to drop the hammer on Donovan's shell companies." Cole hung up the phone and looked at him. Jude was sitting on the floor, spitting blood onto the concrete, his hands shaking violently from the adrenaline crash. "You look like hell, Jude," Cole observed, slipping the sap back into his coat. "I feel like hell," he rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The door to the office clicked open. Toby peeked out, his eyes wide, terrified pools. Seeing his dad on the floor, he ran across the bay, ignoring the groaning men, and threw his arms around Jude's neck, burying his face in his greasy shirt. Jude hugged him back fiercely, closing his eyes, pressing his face into his hair. His phone buzzed on the workbench. Cole walked over, picked it up, and looked at the screen. He tossed it to him. "It's the boss," he said. Jude answered it, putting it to his ear. "Jude," Victoria's voice came through the speaker, cold as liquid nitrogen, but laced with an undercurrent of dangerous electricity. "Cole tells me you had visitors." "I did," he managed to say, his jaw throbbing. "Are you and your son unharmed?" "We're fine. Just some spilled tools and a busted lip." "Good," she said. The sound of a keyboard clacking echoed in the background. "Donovan made a tactical error. He thought he could intimidate my assets. I'm going to bankrupt him by Tuesday. The contract remains yours. Take the weekend to recover. I'm doubling your retainer for the inconvenience." "Victoria, you don't have to—" "I don't negotiate, Jude," she interrupted, her tone softening just a fraction. "Clean up your shop. Buy your boy some ice cream. And welcome to Carmichael Logistics." She hung up. He sat on the floor among the scattered tools, holding his son, the metallic taste of blood still in his mouth. He looked at Cole, who was calmly dragging the unconscious men out of the bay by their collars. The world was vicious, dirty, and unforgiving. But as he held Toby tight against his chest, Jude realized he finally had a predator on his side. Tuesday morning smelled like ozone, fresh paint, and raw cardboard. Cole's cleanup crew had worked through the weekend with the ruthless, terrifying efficiency of a military unit. When Jude finally limped back into the shop, his ribs tightly wrapped in an elastic bandage and a fading yellow bruise sprawling across his jaw, he barely recognized the place. His shattered second-hand tool chests were gone. In their place stood 3 towering gunmetal gray professional cabinets that rolled soundlessly on heavy polyurethane casters. The cracked concrete floor had been power washed and sealed with an industrial epoxy. Even the faint, lingering smell of cheap beer and desperation that had haunted the walls for a decade was scrubbed clean, replaced by the sharp, sterile scent of citrus degreaser. He stood in the center of the bay, holding a cup of decent coffee from a local cafe, feeling like an intruder in his own life. Toby ran past his legs, his sneakers squeaking on the pristine epoxy. He wasn't wearing his faded hand-me-down jacket anymore. Yesterday, Jude had taken him to a real department store. They walked past the clearance racks, straight to the winter gear. He bought him a heavy insulated coat with a faux fur hood. The nylon was stiff, smelling of factory dye and untouched packaging. When he handed his debit card to the cashier, his hand had trembled. He fully expected the machine to shriek its familiar, humiliating decline. It approved instantly. Victoria's retainer had cleared at 3 a.m. on Monday. The number on his banking app was absurd. More money than he had grossed in 3 years sitting there in cold, digital reality. He threw out a half-empty box of generic macaroni and cheese that morning. He tossed it straight into the garbage. Then he stood over the trash can for 5 minutes, staring at the yellow cardboard, fighting a sudden, nauseating wave of guilt. Poverty wires a brain to hoard scraps. Security feels like a trap, waiting to snap shut. A silver sedan pulled into the freshly graded gravel lot. It wasn't a Rolls-Royce, and it certainly wasn't an AMG Mercedes. It was a sensible, unassuming Honda Accord. The driver's door opened, and Chloe Carmichael stepped out. She wore jeans, a plain gray sweater, and white sneakers. The heavy makeup and the terrified, bratty teenager aura were completely gone, replaced by a quiet, awkward hesitation. She carried a white bakery box in one hand and held her purse tightly against her side. Jude set his coffee down on a new stainless steel workbench. His ribs twinged as he straightened his posture. "Shop's closed to the public today," he said, his voice raspy. Chloe stopped at the edge of the bay doors. She looked at his bruised face, her eyes widening slightly, but she didn't retreat. "My mother told me what happened," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the defensive edge it had on the highway. She said someone tried to hurt you because of her company, because of me getting a flat tire. "It's just business," he replied, grabbing a clean rag and pretending to wipe down a perfectly clean wrench. "Guys like Donovan throw tantrums when they lose their leverage. It has nothing to do with you." "It does, though." Chloe stepped into the garage, setting the bakery box on the bench. "If I hadn't taken the car, if I hadn't ruined the tire, my mom would have never met you. You wouldn't have a busted lip. Toby wouldn't have been scared." He stopped wiping the wrench. He looked at the 17-year-old girl. She was shivering, but not from the autumn chill. She was vibrating with genuine remorse. Wealth isolates people, insulates them from the consequences of their actions. But Victoria Carmichael hadn't insulated her daughter this time. She had forced her to look at the wreckage. "I bought pastries," Chloe mumbled, staring at her shoes. "From that place downtown. I know it doesn't fix a broken face, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry for treating you like a servant on the highway. You were the only person who stopped." Jude sighed, the residual tension draining out of his shoulders. He was holding on to anger that didn't belong to this kid. "You didn't ruin my life, Chloe," he said, his tone softening. He tapped the heavy steel workbench. "In fact, your mother just pulled me out of a 10-year hole. We're square." Toby peeked out from the office, smelling the sugar. Chloe looked at him, managed a weak smile, and pushed the box toward the mechanic. "My mom is terrifying," Chloe said suddenly, a spark of dark humor in her voice. "But she said you're the first person in years who didn't back down from her. Keep doing that. She needs it." She turned and walked back to the Honda. He watched her drive away, opening the bakery box. Fresh bear claws and apple fritters. The heavy, sweet smell filled the bay. He handed one to Toby, taking a bite of an apple fritter himself. It tasted like an apology, and for the first time in a long time, it tasted real. November hit the city like a swung bat. The temperature plummeted overnight, freezing the lingering rain into black ice that turned the highways into a graveyard of twisted metal. At 2:14 a.m. on a Thursday, Jude's phone vibrated violently on the nightstand. He jolted awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed the phone, squinting against the harsh screen light. The caller ID simply read, "Carmichael." "Jude." Victoria's voice was clipped, lacking her usual icy composure. There was a raw edge of panic beneath the syllables. "I'm here," he said, swinging his legs out of bed. The floorboards were freezing. "What's wrong? Are you capable of servicing a Carrier Vector 8500 refrigeration unit?" He blinked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "A reefer trailer? Yeah, I hold the certifications, but I haven't wrenched on one in years. Why?" "I have a 53-foot climate-controlled trailer currently sitting dead on the shoulder of Interstate 95, 30 miles north of your location," Victoria said. He could hear the rapid tapping of her keyboard. "It is transporting $3 million worth of temperature-sensitive biologics. Vaccines. If the internal temperature of that trailer drops below 36 degrees, the entire payload denatures and is completely destroyed. Send your overnight guy, or a dealership mobile unit." "I can't," she snapped. The driver pulled over when the unit threw a fault code. He went back to check the compressor, and someone had taken a bolt cutters to the main serpentine belt and smashed the tensioner pulley. "It's sabotage, Jude. Donovan's lingering Union loyalists. They know this payload is insured for millions. They want to trigger a catastrophic claim to force my board of directors to vote me out." He was already pulling on his heavy canvas work pants. "What's the internal temperature right now?" 41 degrees and dropping fast. You have maybe 90 minutes before it hits the critical threshold. Every mobile mechanic within a 50-mile radius is suddenly refusing my dispatch calls. They're terrified of Donovan." Victoria paused, and for the first time he heard her breathe, a ragged, exhausted sound. "I am out of options, Jude. If I lose this freight, I lose the company. Send Cole to my house right now," he barked, grabbing his boots. "He stays with Toby. He doesn't let anyone near this house. I'm taking my truck." He's already 5 minutes away. 40 minutes later, his F-150 was tearing up the shoulder of I-95, his hazard lights flashing wildly against the sleet. The wind howled through the cracked weather, stripping of his doors, biting at his face. He saw the massive Carmichael logistics rig parked under the amber glow of a single sodium street lamp. The driver was standing outside, shivering violently, holding a flashlight. He slammed his truck into park, grabbed his heavy tool bag and a portable halogen work light, and ran toward the front of the trailer. "Open the access panel!" he shouted over the roaring wind. The driver fumbled with the latches, pulling the heavy metal doors open. The smell of raw diesel and leaking Freon hit him instantly. He pointed his halogen light into the mechanical housing. It was a bloodbath of machinery. The heavy rubber serpentine belt was cleanly snipped, lying in the bottom of the housing like a dead snake. The tensioner pulley, the critical wheel that keeps the belt tight so the engine can turn the compressor, was shattered. The cast aluminum cracked completely in half by a blunt instrument. "Internal temp is 39 degrees, the driver yelled, checking his tablet. "Man, it's freezing out here. It's dropping a degree every 10 minutes. Jude stared at the shattered pulley. He didn't have a replacement for a Carrier Vector tensioner in his truck. Even if he did, the mounting bracket was bent. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze him. Millions of dollars, Victoria's entire empire, his entire livelihood. hanging on a broken piece of aluminum in the freezing sleet. Think, he told himself, slapping his own frozen cheeks to force the blood to circulate. You're a mechanic. Stop looking at what's broken and look at what's here. He reached into his bag and pulled out a heavy-duty ratchet strap, a length of steel chain, and a heavy pry bar. Get in the cab, he yelled at the driver. Turn the main ignition key to the on position, but do not crank it until I tell you. His fingers were going numb. The cold metal of the engine block bit through his grease-stained gloves. He dug a spare, universal heavy-duty belt out of his bag. It was slightly too long, but it had to work. He routed it around the crankshaft, the alternator, and the massive air conditioning compressor. Without a tensioner, the belt was completely loose. It would just slip and burn. He hooked one end of the ratchet strap to the heavy steel frame of the trailer. He looped the other end tightly around the alternator bracket. He wedged his steel pry bar behind the alternator, using the engine block for leverage. Okay, he muttered, his breath pluming in white clouds in the freezing air. Redneck engineering. Don't fail me now. He threw his body weight against the pry bar, manually forcing the alternator outward to pull the belt tight. The metal groaned. His bruised ribs screamed in agony, sending a wave of nausea up his throat. Holding the pry bar with his shoulder, he used his left hand to frantically crank the ratchet strap, tightening the nylon webbing to hold the alternator in its new, forced position. Click, click, click. The belt went taut. It wasn't perfect. It was a terrifying, violent geometry of tension that could snap at any second. But it was tight. He stepped back, his chest heaving, sweat freezing on his forehead. He wiped the grease off his face, leaving a dark smear across his cheek. Crank it! He screamed at the cab. The diesel engine of the reefer unit whined sluggishly, fighting the freezing oil. Brrr! Then, with a violent belching roar, it caught. The engine shuddered. He watched the belt. It squealed in protest, smoking slightly as it rubbed against the misaligned pulley, but it caught traction. The massive compressor kicked on with a heavy mechanical thud. Warm air began to blast out of the condenser fans. He stood there for a full minute, watching the jerry-rigged strap violently vibrating. It held. The driver jumped out of the cab, his face pale. He looked at his tablet. 37 degrees. 37.5. 38. It's climbing. The compressor is running. Jude collapsed against the side of his truck, sliding down the frozen metal door until he was sitting on the icy asphalt. His forearms were locked in agonizing cramps. His hands were completely numb, coated in black grime and freezing slush. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He fumbled it out and answered on speakerphone. Jude? Victoria's voice was tight, anxious. Temp is climbing, he wheezed, staring up at the amber street lamp through the sleet. The compressor is running. It's an ugly fix, Victoria. Tell your driver to keep it under 50 and take the smoothest roads possible, but it will hold until he reaches the depot. A long, heavy silence stretched over the line. He could hear the background noise on her end, the muted voices of executives, the rustle of papers. I owe you a great deal, Jude, she finally said. Her voice wasn't cold anymore. It was quiet. It was human. More than money. You don't owe me anything, he said, slowly getting to his feet, his joints popping in protest. We had a contract. I did the job. Now I'm going home to thaw out my hands and see my kid. Drive safe, she said, and the line clicked dead. He followed the rig for 20 miles, holding his breath every time it hit a pothole, but the red ratchet strap held the line. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the sun was just beginning to bleach the gray sky. Cole was sitting in a chair on his porch, wrapped in a heavy coat, a thermos of coffee at his feet. He looked at Jude's exhausted, freezing, grease-covered form. He simply nodded, stood up, and walked to his sedan without a word. He went inside. The house was warm. Toby was sound asleep in his bed. Jude stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. They were safe. Spring washed over the city, turning the muddy remnants of winter into vibrant, aggressive green. The air was thick with the smell of wet pavement and blooming honeysuckle. His shop wasn't a two-bay garage anymore. Over the winter, with the backing of a 5-year ironclad contract from Carmichael Logistics, he bought the abandoned warehouse next door. They knocked down the adjoining walls, poured new concrete, and installed 4 massive commercial hydraulic lifts. The hum of pneumatic tools and the heavy bass of a radio echoed through the cavernous space. He wasn't the only guy turning wrenches anymore. He had 3 mechanics on payroll, guys he knew, guys who had been chewed up and spit out by dealerships, guys who knew the value of a hard dollar and showed up sober at 6 in the morning. He was standing at the main workbench, reviewing a stack of digital diagnostic readouts on an iPad. He wore a pair of dark blue canvas work pants and a clean gray uniform shirt with his name embroidered over the pocket. His boots were still scuffed, his fingernails still stained with the permanent shadow of grease, but the crushing weight of panic that used to live in his chest was gone. "Your left front rotor is glazed. The caliper is sticking." He looked up. Victoria Carmichael was standing in the open bay doors. She wasn't wearing a suit. Today she wore a pair of high-waisted dark jeans, a crisp white button-down, and a pair of leather riding boots. She looked completely relaxed, standing in the middle of an active commercial garage, entirely unfazed by the noise and the dirt. She walked over to his bench, setting a pair of sunglasses down. "I heard you expanded," she said, looking around the massive shop. "It looks efficient. It's loud, it's dirty, and it smells like gear oil," he replied, crossing his arms. "But it works. What brings the CEO out of her tower? You usually send Cole for the monthly audits." "I'm not here for an audit." Victoria leaned against the workbench, crossing her arms to mirror his stance. "Donovan formally filed for bankruptcy this morning. His board completely abandoned him after the stunt on I-95. The feds are looking into his union ties." "Good," he said bluntly. He didn't feel any pity for the man. He had tried to take food out of his son's mouth. Victoria tilted her head, studying him. "You didn't show up to the gala last month. I sent you an invitation, front table." He let out a short, cynical laugh. "Victoria, look at me. I'm a mechanic. I don't own a tuxedo, and I don't know how to talk to venture capitalists. I would have stuck out like a bleeding thumb, and you know it." "I know," she said smoothly. "Which is exactly why I wanted you there. I am surrounded by men who wear $3,000 suits and would sell their own mothers for a point of market share. I wanted them to look at the man who actually keeps this company moving. I wanted them to see what actual leverage looks like." She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick document bound in blue leather. She slid it across the stainless steel bench toward him. "What is this?" he asked, eyeing the legal binding. "It's a franchise agreement," Victoria said, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. "I'm acquiring 3 new distribution hubs in the tri-state area. I need regional maintenance directors. I don't want contractors anymore. I want partners. This document outlines a 20% equity stake in the regional maintenance division." He stared at the leather-bound book. Equity. Ownership. It wasn't just a paycheck anymore. It was a seat at the table. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a guy who fixed a flat tire in the rain." "Because you didn't flinch," Victoria answered immediately. "When Donovan sent muscle, you didn't back down. When my rig broke down in the freezing cold, you didn't make excuses. You used a ratchet strap to save my company. You understand consequence, Jude, and more importantly, you understand loyalty." She pushed the document an inch closer. "Sign it. Hire more men. Build an empire out of this garage. Your son deserves it." He looked out the window of the office. Toby was sitting at a real desk, doing his homework under a bright lamp. He was wearing clean clothes. He had a full stomach. He wasn't afraid of the phone ringing anymore. He picked up the heavy brass pen lying on his clipboard. He flipped the leather cover open to the signature page. He didn't read the fine print. He trusted her. She was a shark, but she was his shark. He signed his name. The ink was dark and permanent. Victoria took the document, slipping it back into her bag. She offered her hand. He looked at her perfectly manicured fingers, then down at his own rough, calloused hand. He reached out and shook it. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Welcome to the board, Jude, she said, a genuine warm smile finally breaking across her face. She turned and walked out to her SUV. He watched her pull away, the tires crunching on the fresh gravel. He walked over to the slop sink in the corner of the bay. He pumped a heavy glob of gritty orange pumice soap into his palms and turned on the hot water. He scrubbed the dirt, the oil, the brake dust. Grease doesn't completely wash out. It stains cuticles and settles deep into the lifelines of calloused palms. But as he dried his hands on a clean towel, looking around his sprawling, noisy, beautiful shop, he realized he didn't mind the stains anymore. They weren't marks of failure. They were the blueprints of survival. If Jude's relentless grit and Victoria's ruthless loyalty struck a chord with you, don't just scroll past. People know what it feels like to be underestimated, pushed down, and treated like the dirt on someone's tires. But this story proves that doing the hard, honest thing when nobody is watching is the ultimate power move. Hit that like button to respect the hustle. Share this video with someone grinding for their family, and absolutely smash that subscribe button for more deeply human, raw, and unapologetic stories of people fighting their way to the top. Keep wrenching.